whoever is your client, you will give this particular IP and this particular IP needs to be attached on top of the load balancer. So I'll go ahead and I'll say add a front-end IP configuration. And what I'll do as I'll give a name to this IP, I'll say this is just IP load balancer. I'll say this is an IPv4 address and I'll say create a new IP address. The IP address name is IP load balancer, something like this. And I'll say okay and I'll say add. So now I am creating an IP address for this particular load balancer, and the name of the IP address would be IP load balancer out here, and and it tells that this needs to be created, that this IP needs to be provisioned. So once I create the load balancer, during the creation of the load balancer, the IP kind of gets created out there, and I'll go to the next tab, which is something called as a backend pool. So here, if you look at the definition, the backend pool is nothing but the collection of resources to which your load balancer can send traffic to. It can contain something called virtual machines, scale sets, and also something known as a container out here. I'm interested into something called virtual machines, and I'll say add a backend pool. This is where I'm establishing the connection. This is where I'm establishing the connection between the load balancer and the virtual machines that are running in the background. So I'll say add a pool, and here it just asks me a couple of information like what is the pool name. I'll say this is pool a simple pool, any name that any name that you can give out here, and I'll select the virtual network, just demo RGVNet, the virtual network in which these machines are running in. And here I'll just scroll down and I'll say add. Once I add, I have the demo VM 1, 2, and 3 that are running inside the resource group. So I'll just add these three into the pool A and I'll say save. So what I'm doing right now, is just going ahead, adding these three machines into that particular pool called pool A, and it's adding the NIC card of these machines, which are running at a private IP called 10.0.0.4, 5, and 6 respectively. I'll say next, and now I will add something called as a load balancing rule. What do I mean by a rule? Is I need to tell the load balancer how do you divert sorry, how do you divert the traffic, where do you divert the traffic, and which port you need to listen to. Meaning, do you want to listen to HTTP or HTTPS or any other port? And if you get a traffic at this particular HTTP, which is port 80, then where do you divert the traffic to? Okay, if it's a backend VM, which port of the VM you need to divert the traffic to? Is it 80? Is it 443? What it is? This model of diverting traffic is called NAT, Network Address Translation. Meaning, what is the source? Where are you getting the source from? And how do you want to divert the traffic to that particular destination out there? So what I'll do is I'll come here, add something called as a load balancing rule, and I'll say this is rule 1, some random name. I'll say if you get any traffic at a front-end IP, which is the IP of the load balancer, please go ahead and divert the traffic to a backend pool called pool A, which contains 3 virtual machines. And I also need to tell what kind of a traffic is this. And I'll say if you get a traffic at a port called 80, which is HTTP, because this is a HTTP, let's say this is an internet facing load balancer. So I'm exposing a port called 80. I'm saying please divert the traffic to a backend port called 80, because this is where all my virtual machines are actually listening. VM1, VM2, and VM3 are internet services that are listening at port 80. So I'm telling if someone hits you at a port 80, sorry, someone hits your port 80, please divert them into the backend ports of 80, 80, and 80 for the respective virtual machines out here. So what I'll do, so let me come back. Let's scroll down, and there is something called as a health probe. Probe here is nothing but checking, meaning in order to divert the traffic, load balancer has to understand that the machine is healthy or not. Is the machine really alive? Is the machine really responding? Is the machine really working? Is something that the load balancer needs to understand, for which we configure something called as a health probe. I'll say create new. So now it's telling health probes are used to check the status of the backend pool instance. If the probe fails to get a response, then no new connections will be sent to that particular backend pool until the health probe succeeds again. What I'll do, I'll just scroll down. I'll give a name to the probe telling that this is a sample health probe. I'll say here the protocol is HTTP or TCP, anything's okay. I'll say the port in which you need to check the virtual machines in the backend is 80, and please check them for every 5-second interval. You can say this is 10, 15, whatever it is. I'm taking a simple 5-second interval out here. I'll just scroll down, and there is something called use by and all these things, and I'll say okay. And I'll just go ahead and I'll say add this out. So now I'm telling that there's a rule which diverts your traffic whenever someone interacts with this particular IP address of the load balancer over the internet, which is port 80. Please divert the traffic into a backend pool which contains 3 machines, and in between the load balancer and the backend pools, I'm creating something called as a health probe, which for every 5 seconds checks whether this particular machines are healthy or not, and understands, okay, fine, if these are healthy, then I'll divert the traffic. If it's not, then I won't divert the traffic out here, is what your health probe really tells you. So this is the inbound rule, and you don't need an outbound rule out here. I'll say next, tags, and I'll review and create this out. And I'll hit the create button out here. So if you look at what we are doing, let me hit the create button and let me go to the notepad and explain what we're doing out there. Again, it's running the final validation sparse. I'll say create. So now if you look at this one, I'm creating a load balancer with these properties. Type of the load balancer is a regional public load balancer. And then I'm configuring something called as the IP address for the load balancer. Then we are mentioning something called backend pools. And backend pools is all the machines that you want to, let's say, handle the traffic to. And finally, we are configuring something called inbound rules and a health probe for this particular load balancer, which can continuously monitor the health of the services that are running in the background. So inbound rules and the health probe. So all these together will give you a resource called a load balancer out here. So if you look at this, it's going ahead creating the IP load balancer, which is the load balancer itself. Oh, sorry, which is, let's say, the IP address for the load balancer. Then it's creating the load balancer, and then it's doing something called as a NIC card update. We'll understand what NIC card update really is out here. After the load balancer gets created, we'll understand what really this is. So it'll take around 2 or 3 minutes of time to get this created. So any questions clear that I can take? Anyone, any question that I can take till here?
Uh,
What be a global load balancer? We'll talk about what global load balancing really is. But let's talk about what regional is, and then we can go to global out there. Yes.
so, I mean,
Mhm.
if we have load balancer, we don't need public IPs, or like, I mean,
You don't really need a public IP out here for the machine, because
mhm.
uh, reason A is that if you have a public IP to a machine, you're exposing yourself to the internet for something which is
Yeah,
inside the network. So that's something which we don't generally do. B
okay,
is that when you create, let's say, 100 machines, okay, and when you attach public IPs to it, you'll end up having 100 different public IPs, for which each and every public
yes,
IP you need to pay some amount of cost, which is
yes.
again a overhead cost out here. So if you
So,
are doing a Good.
Yeah. My doubt is like, so we are taking the domain, whichever domain IP we are using, we put it to the,
Correct.
we provide it to the load balancer. That is what we are
Exactly.
doing.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you have a domain called xyz.com,
Mhm. Mhm.
I'll just divert, or I'll just say that whenever someone comes to xyz.com, please divert them to the IP address that is attached to my load balancer. So you as a user, you'll go to xyz.com out here and you'll go to the IP address of the load balancer. Load balancer will do the internal diversion of the traffic out
Okay.
here. Yes. Any more questions? Does the load balancer go down? Very, very rare case scenario, especially when you create a standard load balancer. But yes, see, load balancer is nothing but a virtual machine that is running in the background, which just acts as a traffic diversion, let's say, kind of a device. So can the load balancer go down? Very, very less cases. I personally haven't seen load balancers, let's say, going down out there. But can you have cases? Definitely yes. You can have cases of load balancers also going down out there. Yes. Any more questions here? Anyone? Any more questions here? Okay. Please provide me the PowerShell script. What pool exact do? Pool is okay. Just a second. Please provide me the PowerShell script. Yes, definitely. I forgot to send across the PowerShell script, which is a good reminder. So I'll just copy this out, paste this out here, and this is a PowerShell script that I've been using to go ahead and, let's say, create that particular IIS and install that particular, let's say, uh, IIS, and then put the default HTML page out there. What does the pool exact do? Pool just contains what are your resources that you want to divert your traffic to. Let's say if you have 100 machines, you can have all those 100 machines in a pool and tell that you want all the traffic to divert into that particular pool. So pool here acts as a folder or acts as a resource group, kind of, let's say a resource group, let's say, under which you have all your virtual machines and you can divert your traffic to that particular virtual machines out there. Yes, any more questions here? Anyone? Any more questions here? Okay, so